Dr. Robert Joseph, our Ambassador of Reconciliation Canada, is a legend who took on all that life threw at him and emerged as a beacon of compassion, love, and a man who has shown us all how to embrace our common humanity. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. All of us as adults have something inside of us that really comes from our childhood that helps form who we are as adults. What was your childhood like?
It was so idyllic and familiar, and in our culture, we were still one with that environment, one with that place and the surrounding territory around it.
And what happened at 6?
Is when I went to residential school after that.
How does that happen? Does somebody knock on your door and say,
Yeah,
come with me?
There were different ways. For my older brother, he was 2 years older than me, but he was conscious that at a certain time people would come to take us away, right? So you could hear a boat from a long way off, especially when there's no traffic at all around. So his age group would rush to the back of the village where the forest line is, and they would climb the highest trees they could to avoid being apprehended by the authorities, either the RCMP or the Indian agent and his representatives. And they would stay in those trees till they could hear the boat departing again. The sad part of that story was that they would always come another day. So sooner or later, my brother and his peers would be taken to school. When I first went to school, my foster mother took me. We got on a small boat and went to Alert Bay, to St. Michael's Indian Residential School. And we've heard a lot of stories about those institutions. And it's sad to say that the things that happened there were true. They were so harmful and destructive, and especially with a little child who might be 6 years old and even younger, there was no way of knowing what was to come. As a child growing up still at home, I felt I was center of the universe. They had magical names for you. We were precious and we were loved and connected to all of this. And we had this one culture, one language that everybody subscribed to, that anyone living and being part of this environment was important, was of value, had a purpose, and ought to be nurtured and looked after until they grew into their own being.
And all of a sudden, you're a 6-year-old child.
Yeah. And then you found yourself in an environment where nobody really cared. You were just almost like chattel, or maybe cattle. They took you and placed you in these schools. And for all the time that I was ever in those schools, and it was 11 years altogether, I was never ever told in all my life experience here that I was important or significant or smart or intelligent and valued and cherished and loved, and that I belong to something bigger than beyond my own little fears as a child, right? And so, and they were cruel. Can I tell you a story about when I first got there? The very first day we walked to that residential. Alert Bay is a tiny island, Cormorant Island. And we were billeting. We got there the evening before and billeted with relatives. And so the next day we began to walk to St. Michael's School, my mother and I, my foster mother. And it was the most silent walk I've ever taken in my life. My mother didn't say, you know where we're going, you're going there for this. There was just nothing spoken about what was happening. And so we got near the building. I'd never seen a multi-story building before, and that was pretty frightening. And as we got near there, I saw a man standing on the top of the steps, and I wondered who could he be. So we walked up those steps. The man beckoned us up to the steps. And the man in a strange language was talking to my mother, who didn't speak English, and saying whatever he was saying. I didn't understand. My mother didn't understand. And then he grabbed me by the hand and she handed me over to him. And I looked back one more time to see what my mother was doing. And she didn't say anything, like it was still silent. She didn't say, "Don't worry, I'll be back, I'll visit you often, so it's okay." She turned and walked away, and I couldn't understand that. I thought, why is my mother abandoning me? And what is this strange man doing, taking me from my mother? And then we proceeded down, and this was the first floor. We proceeded down into the basement, into the playroom area, the boys' playroom area. There were over 200 kids. There was a girl side and a boy side, and each side had 110 or so kids, more or less. And when we got to the basement, there were a bunch of little boys like me, same age as me, all standing there naked and waiting in line for the barber to crop their hair. Just, it wasn't a haircut, just cropped their hair. And then when we were all done, they ushered us into this common shower room, and it had about 6 or 7 shower cells. And they herded us all in there. And that wasn't bad enough. They poked and prodded us in embarrassing places and ways. Eventually, they hollered instructions for us all to get out of the shower. And then we all had to wait till we were called on, and they doused our heads in kerosene. And then when that was done, they painted us with this white liquid, our entire body. It was so humiliating and embarrassing and scary, actually. Eventually, through the evening, we ended up in the dormitories. And when they finally turned out the lights, and we were all little boys in one dormitory, I could hear the sniffles all through the dorm, all these little kids scared to death and hiding under the covers. And for some reason, I wasn't crying yet, but I got under the covers and I started to just listen, and pretty soon I was overcome by the experience too. So I started crying and crying until I couldn't cry anymore, like no more tears, right? And the next morning, I didn't realize I'd hear this bell 1,000,000 times more. It was the clanging of this big bell, and the supervisor broke through the door of the dorm, banging and hollering for everybody to get up, strip people, covers off the people, flip some of the beds upside down, and all the time screaming obscenities and just denigration in general, right?
Can you give me an example what they'd be screaming?
It was just, it was a cruel environment. The people who they got to work there, I don't think they were Christians, because I would expect them to behave a little differently if they were. Right? But they were so cruel, and they didn't care. And the only interest they had was to be able to manage and control the numbers of little children in their care. So you do that by discipline, by fear-mongering, by control, in different ways, right?
What kind of discipline?
Oh, there was lots of discipline. In the classrooms, for instance, they had leather straps right when we were still little kids yet. Or pointers. Pointers were another really favorite way to hurt you if you're in contravention of order or whatever they thought it was. Or dragging us by the ears, or cuffing us on the ears, or pulling us by the head, or standing us in corners for hours. So we had all of that going. The food was awful. We were always hungry. So we would be forced whenever we could to steal. Like maybe late at night, we'd go into the dining room area and look for food, bread or biscuits or something, just to quell the hunger. And the food we had was really malnutritious. The very first breakfast I had was a bowl of porridge. And I looked in there, and there was these little black-headed worms in there, right in the middle. So I looked around either side of me, and I saw what the other little boys were doing, and they were just pushing those little worms or whatever that were to the side and eating from the center. Those are real, true stories. Some of my friends still talk about it, right? And so we had to eat that kind of food. Everything was bland. If we were lucky to have peanut butter, it was mostly lard because they mix it, I guess, so it goes further, and that tastes pretty awful. And when we had soup, it was just watery, a gray watery. I don't know what they might have put in there, maybe a few green peas or something, but always hungry. And so we would, whenever we had the opportunity, steal from the root house. They had a root house there. St. Michael's School at Alert Bay was an industrial school. It had a farm. In the beginning, it was intended to be self-sustaining. So they grew turnips, potatoes, other things. There was an orchard. And so they would be the target of our stealing. That's what we knew we could probably get away with. So we did a lot of that. And I know when we stole potatoes, there was a big boiler room in that complex. When night fell and the staff were all doing whatever they do late at night and they're not around wandering, looking at everything, we would sneak into the boiler room with those stolen potatoes and put them into the back of the furnace where there were crevices that you could place the potatoes, and they'd become thickened black covered potatoes. And we'd eat that kind of thing, right? And so there was a lot of hunger. It created some bad habits for us, I guess.
What was the worst physical abuse you suffered?
Mostly it was physical abuse, but sexual abuse wasn't very far behind. I was a very little boy still, and the constant berating, denigrating was something that began in day one and never ended, right?
You said that they would bang you around the ears.
Yeah, that's why I wore these hearing aids, right?
Do you think that that's a direct result?
Yeah, absolutely. The brutality was just pervasive, really pervasive in those early years. Sometimes I tell people that I think that of all the damage that I suffered personally in St. Michael's School happened in the first 2 years. So you could have sent me home after the second year, and I would that damage would still be resonating in my DNA, and I'd be still angry and raging and dysfunctional and becoming an alcoholic and stuff like that.
So take me on your journey. You finally leave this school, all this damage that's been done. How did you cope?
I didn't always cope. And the first sign of that is when you simply drink because you can't take it anymore. You don't want to understand it. You don't want to deal with it. You want to forget about it. So what you do is drink. And I've always been a likable character. Most people that I've met in my life are kind, and they respond to you with kindness. But when those memories haunted me, my first impulse was to have a drink. Forget it, let it go. And I didn't know that it was a progression and that it followed me all of my growing adult life. And so the consequences personally for me, in terms of jobs and being able to provide for my family, were significant. I just had no way of knowing how to be a parent even, or how to be a husband. And my marriage and my raising of my children was doomed almost to failure. That I just didn't understand. I didn't know how to express my feelings, because in those schools you shut it in. You can't afford to express your feelings. So when I should have been telling my kids how much I loved them, and I loved them deeply, and my wife and I loved her deeply, I wasn't, because I didn't have the skill set or even an experience or a way of being to do that naturally, like ordinary parents must do. Like,
So you had to hit bottom before you could turn around.
yeah, trauma is a really awful thing. It comes back and haunts you at any moment, any time, any day. And when you suffer those moments of re-traumatization, they're just as real as when you were a little guy going through whatever you were going through. And so I reached that point in my life, and also this can be an important story. So I had been drinking so long, and there would be days I might still go back to work in the beginning, but eventually there were fewer and fewer days I'd go back to work. And then I realized what I'd become. I'd almost become, or maybe I was, part of the scene, the town drunk, drinking every day, walking around in a stupor. And I'd go home at night, and it's insane. I'm listening for the pitter-patter of my kids in the other rooms, and they've been gone now. Or my wife walking up the pathway to the house, and none of those things, of course, ever happened. So one day I was downtown in Camera River, and I met an old friend of mine. He was a skipper on a seine boat, and I used to fish with him. I ran into him, and he said, "Hey, Bob, I really don't like what you're doing to yourself. You should get out of town for a while. Come fishing with me for a day or so." And I never hesitated. I just knew how much trouble I'd become. I'd been in. And I said, "Yeah, I'll go fishing with you." And I don't know how I got there to the boat. I don't know when or how. But I woke up early the next morning, and I'm not fully awake, but when I am, I realize I'm in a bunk. And then I start smelling the smell of booze when you've been on a tear for a long time. And then the humiliation and the shame and the sadness just creeped all over me. I looked around, and the crew were all sleeping. And I was so ashamed of myself. I tiptoed out of the bunk through the engine room up to the galley where we eat, and then to the back of the boat. And it's the same boat. They got huge big drums in the back of the boat. And I threw myself behind the drum to hide. And I got nobody to hide from. Everybody's still asleep in the boat. But as I did that, and I crouched behind the drum, I started to see through my tears. I know when I threw myself, I said, "God help me," and it wasn't a prayer, because I'd been sort of getting angry at God because of all the things, right? But when I opened my eyes, I looked over the gunwale of the boat, and Johnson Straits was the body of water that we were on. I saw Johnson Strait, so beautiful, so powerful. It was coral green and blue and brilliant, and you saw energy in it that I'd never seen ever, then or now. And then I looked up, like to the heavens, right, upward, and I saw the entire universe. It's like indescribable. I wish I could paint it, and I probably couldn't, because I can't quite remember, other than the pure power and beauty of this universe. And then I heard a voice, and it said, "In spite of what you've done to yourself, I love you, and you're a part of all of this." And all of a sudden I came back to the moment, and it changed my life forever, of course, when I came back to the moment and I heard. And I knew instantly, immediately, why that voice said what it said. It was because that one of the overriding emotions of most kids who went to those schools was loneliness, not belonging, being disconnected. And for someone to say, you're a part of all of this and I love you. I could never restrict thinking of myself as just being nothing anymore. Imagine, even if I'm infinitesimally small, I'm part of this universe. How big is that, right?
And the voice said you were loved.
Yeah, and that you belong. That's what it said.
As he found his footing, he was asked to speak to others, which led to more and more requests to speak to the impacts of the residential school system on Indigenous youth. Former Lieutenant Governor Stephen Point heard him and asked Robert to head up BC's residential school project. And today, Chief Joseph is our ambassador to Reconciliation Canada. When I ask you the question, okay, what now? Like, what does reconciliation mean to you? What should it mean to me? What do we do?
What we should do is adopt reconciliation as a core value, like a real core value. We live it, we breathe it, we wake up in the morning to it, live it out through all of the entirety of a day, and our mind is on making sure that reconciliation is a practice that we should embrace and practice, promote. And how do we do that? Well, of course, we do it by starting with self. So reconciliation starts with you, absolutely. Every Canadian, every Indigenous person, really. And we grow it out by creating very individual, very personal reconciliation action plans.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
To quote Chief Dr. Joseph, reconciliation in all of its forms requires patience, openness, and courage, and it happens one person to another. Chief Dr. Robert Joseph, a BC legend.